Please be advised that this serving of AIDS, the Lost Voices, may cause offense or upset, as
we read newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s that may include language and phrases that may be viewed outdated. Some articles and discussions may include brief references and descriptions to self-harm, death, post-mortem, and the odd uncontrollable expletive not suitable for children or adults that act like children. Roll it.
AIDS brings a response
Fight
from the
against
government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
Welcome to Extra Tea with your camp host, William Hampson.
And my fabulous co-host, Gloria.
Between us, we'll be looking back through the decades at how Britain reported on the AIDS pandemic.
And where we will try to unpick individual stories in the newspaper archives from the 80s, 90s, and noughties.
Ready?
Ready.
All right, let's do it.
So, first things first, anybody who's listened previously to AIDS, the Lost Voices may have noticed that we have a new Gloria.
Hey.
Hello and welcome.
It's good to be here, I think.
Thank you, cheeky
Slightly
pig.
nervous as you haven't shared what happened to the last Gloria.
Well, it really depends, doesn't it? Because I think you're now the third Gloria that I've had on the show. But to let you into a little secret, the last Gloria, she was a 6'4" chain-smoking lesbian truck driver.
Okay.
And she found a new bird, Babs, and the bitch just took off, travelling from coast to coast in a
Wow.
12-foot RV. That's a two-berth caravan to the British listeners. And left me high and dry and in the lurch. But you've kindly stepped forward to come and help out a damsel in distress.
No way. Really?
No, not really. I'm just pulling your leg. But if I have to confess, in the last episode that we did together, we got into a little bit of a fight over the last mini Battenberg. And
Oh, dear.
I had to, well, you know, it was me or her, if you get what I mean.
Okay. Thankfully, I'm not a fan of Battenberg.
Wash your mouth out. Don't like Battenberg. Gloria. But anyway, before this descends into an unofficial spin-off of Bake Off,
Okay.
shall we get started?
Let's do it. I can't wait.
Okay, let's do it.
So, when I looked at the brief for this episode, it seems the stories are all art-related.
That's right. And this first article that we're going to look at covers an AIDS-related art exhibition from March 1996. The exhibition is titled Brenda and Other Stories, and it was officially opened by singer Boy George at the Walsall Museum and Art Gallery. Now, the Guardian newspaper on the 15th of March 1996 published an article with the headline, Cut to Ribbon, which of course is a nod to the AIDS red ribbon.
Yeah.
The article by journalist Robert Clark only seems to come off the back of a Conservative councillor's comments when he was asked to respond with his thoughts to the art exhibition on AIDS. The Walsall councillor Melvin Pitt said, and I quote, "This is perverse, weirdo, jumped-up crap that's supposed to be art. Unless art stands for any rotten trash," see what he did there, quite clever, "and worst thing is that children are going to be shown it."
Wow, that's some response.
I know, right? And while his language is questionable, even for 1996, I must admit, once I read what the exhibits were and saw photos of the pieces, I was a little bit,
Was it not art, like he said?
A lot of the art editors that did an article on it for their newspapers do mention in the articles that the exhibition hadn't come to their attention until he'd made these comments, and that piqued their interest to go and look at the exhibition, and actually they reviewed it quite favourably. So really his comments only piqued an interest and saw a high turnout to the exhibition. And I'm not really an artsy-fartsy type of person. I mean, I can't explain it. It's probably best if we should just read into the articles and then you'll be able to hear for yourself.
Okay.
And the article from the Guardian newspaper reads, "The work that gives the show its title Brenda, by Czech-born New York-based artist Burton is an assemblage of 144 AIDS charity ribbons pinned to the gallery wall."
Sounds pleasant enough. What's wrong?
Well, wait, there's more.
Okay.
Each red ribbon has been transformed from fashion accessory into artwork by being coated with an AIDS victim's grey ashes. A brass plaque beneath reads, "The cremated remains of Brenda Woods, born 5th of July 1947, died 1st of November 1989. Woods was a prostitute and drug addict, and her brother kept the ashes for years before donating them to the cause of commemoration through art."
Oh, I see where you're coming from. It's different.
I'm torn. I think it's a genius way of highlighting that people are dying from AIDS by gluing their ashes to, the red AIDS ribbon. But
And the story of Brenda Woods and HIV/AIDS will live on through the medium of art.
I like it, but I don't know, it just seems to be very personal.
Do we get to learn more about Brenda Woods?
We do, and through another article that appeared in the Birmingham Post on the 20th of February 1996 with the headline, Controversy Raises AIDS Awareness. Now, the article gives a bit more of an insight into who Brenda Woods was, and it reads, Woods had a sad life. She was a lesbian who drifted into prostitution and drug addiction, contracting the virus from a needle. Her brother Paul kept her ashes for several years before collaborating, so to speak, with Benez on the memorial which dramatically reconnected the ribbon, now little more than a politically correct fashion accessory. And given the exhibition is proving to be a little bit controversial, mainly off the back of the comments of that counsellor Melvin Pitt, Terry Grimley, the arts editor who wrote this article, does ask the question, bad taste? Before giving his opinion where he states, no worse, as far as I can see, than expecting professional footballers to run about in the ashes of their most devoted fans. And, to address the inevitable question about the exhibition, is it art? The answer, I'm afraid, is yes, it is. This doesn't mean you have to like it, but it falls well within the parameters which contemporary art has been marking out for many years now.
Yes, he puts it so eloquently.
Very eloquent, but also as well, he's right. As he says, you don't have to like it, but it is art. And the main exhibit that was causing this controversy off the back of the comments of the counsellor was a piece by the main artist himself, Burton, who had organised this exhibition, and which was highlighted in this article by the art editor Terry Grimley, says, the shock horror response has focused on two exhibits, the first exhibit being the cremated remains of Brenda Woods on the red AIDS ribbons, by New York-based Czech artist Barton Benez. One part of a series called Lethal Weapon consists of a water pistol filled with Benez's own HIV-positive blood. Contrary to inaccurate press reports, there's a shocker, the blood does not, quote, squirt. The water pistol is behind reinforced glass and, to respond further to the implication that the exhibit is somehow dangerous, the blood has been heat-treated even though the HIV virus in any case cannot live outside the body.
I'm not an arty type, but looking at the photo of the piece in the article, I like it. It's really clever.
Yeah, I think it's genius because you've got a water pistol on a pillow, and out of the back of the water pistol that you would normally run under the tap to fill with water is a clear plastic tube, and on the end of that tube is a syringe. And in the syringe, it looks like there's blood. And at the front of the gun, which would usually fire out the water, on this pillow seems to be like a spray of blood, like blood stains of spray. So it's the gun is firing the blood. So I just thought, wow, this is really quite cool. But because sometimes with art I can be a little bit slow, it wasn't until I read further down the article where it explains what was the thinking behind this piece that I just was like, my mind was just blown. And the article continues. In a note, the artist refers to the wearing routine of constant blood tests and says that he wanted to do something that reflected and, quote, had fun with the subject. It may seem an odd phrase to use, but Benez's target is media hysteria on the subject of HIV infection, and on this occasion, he seems to have hit it. Oh, I just find the piece genius.
I agree.
And there's no escaping that, Barton Benez was an absolutely amazingly talented artist, and he exhibited works around the globe and in some of the biggest and most prestigious institutions.
Wow.
He worked tirelessly using his own HIV status and his art in his HIV advocacy work, and was described as a terrorist in his work against the stigma around HIV and AIDS.
Awesome.
Sadly, Barton Benez died on the 30th of May 2012, aged 69 years old, from kidney failure in New York.
The next story is from January 13th, 1985, when the News of the World published a story with the headline, Art Genius Destroyed by Gay Killer Bug,
with the strapline, Fast Eddie's Downfall. And as is common, as we've learned, anything HIV/AIDS related is often deemed by the media as an exclusive to entice the reader. And the article reads, soaring young artist Edward Cairns had the world at his feet. He was handsome, talented, and on his way to the top. But he was also a fast-living homosexual and one of the latest victims of the gay plague AIDS that is sweeping Britain. Eddie, 34, a devout Buddhist, died alone in a miserable council flat on the edge of an industrial estate. He had become a drink-sodden recluse who had lost weight, dignity and the will to live. Eddie lay dead for 2 days before he was discovered by a friend calling to collect a £20 debt.
The newspaper isn't painting a sympathetic picture, are they?
No, and, we see this time and time again, and it makes me wonder how this newspaper confirmed much of what they claim. Miserable council flat, lost his dignity and will to live. I mean, how did they confirm any of that? And he was only discovered not by a concerned friend, but, quote, a friend calling to collect a £20 debt. I mean, how do they know that? We see this time and time again, the journalist, the newspaper, telling the reader, don't feel any sympathy for this person, for Eddie. And this is clear as the article continues. His body was taken in a sealed plastic bag to Hammersmith Mortuary, West London, where frightened workers refused to take it out. The body was bundled into a freezer, still in the bag, until Buddhist friends claimed it for cremation.
Bundled into a freezer. How awful.
I mean, looking back retrospectively, we know how the News of the World operated.
Yeah.
But it's the language, isn't it? Again, it's telling the reader, don't feel any sympathy because the people that, you would entrust with looking after a deceased's body with the due care and sympathy and attention have just bundled it. They've just chucked it into a freezer. It's just so dehumanizing. It's just, it makes you sick. And you kind of hope really in reality that it wasn't bundled into a freezer, that it was treated with the care and respect that everybody else was treated with. And again, highlighting that it's a plastic bag. We don't see that with a lot of, more sympathetic stories when people have passed away. They would probably just say the body was removed or the body was taken to the mortuary. So again, it's just this sensationalist language to not only just invoke fear, but also as well vilifying people with HIV/AIDS or the gay community, because, they've already highlighted that it's a gay man living in the fast lane and this is the gay plague. And as the News of the World article continues, they've found and spoken to somebody who knew and worked with Eddie, and the article states, Eddie was a marvellous personality and one of the best young artists in Britain, said Mossafar Aminian, director of Big Strawberry Design Company. He had vast potential. He illustrated some postcards for us which were a sellout. All he wanted to do was paint and live at the fastest pace possible.
This is more like it. Someone giving a true insight into what made Eddie tick. That statement alone makes this article so chalk and cheese.
So chalk and cheese. This is very clever of the journalist, and you see this in a lot of these stories where building somebody up just to then enjoy bringing them back down. Because let's not forget, he's a homosexual, he's promiscuous, he's got the gay plague, he lives in a miserable council flat. So, it's very clever how the journalists were able to manipulate the reader, and we get to see this play out in the rest of the article because they track down Eddie's previous landlord, Reg Kerr Bell. Now, Reg Kerr Bell actually is still alive today, and he was in the media in regards to the Grenfell disaster, because years before the disaster, he was apparently raising concerns in regards to the management, and he resigned from the management company that was managing Grenfell Tower. So when the disaster happened, he was back in the media limelight again. But Reg Kerr Bell said of Eddie Cairns, he was promiscuous, he went full tilt at life and used to go to a lot of wild parties and gay discos.
I have no idea of who Reg is, but he sounds like the type of guy who plays Scrabble by himself.
I'd be inclined to agree, actually. It doesn't come across as though he's been malicious. It perhaps comes across that he's just been very honest and, almost like the class nerd, a bit of a telltale tit. But he goes on to say, he knew the risk of AIDS, but his attitude was, if it happens, it happens. But he never really thought it would happen to him, says Reg. The article continues, Eddie contracted AIDS a year ago.
And this article is from January 1985. So are they saying he contracted AIDS in 1984?
Well, this article in the News of the World was published days before the inquest concluded into the death of Eddie Cairns. So I think they mean he died of an AIDS-related illness back in October 1984, given this is January 1985. Because his body was found on the 4th of October 1984. Given what we know today, and they kind of vaguely, loosely knew of in 1985, HIV takes more than a year to become an AIDS diagnosis that could then result in an AIDS-related death. Unless really the News of the World's objective here is to imply that once you contract AIDS, it's an instant death. You die instantly, which wouldn't surprise me actually, but there you go. And the article continues, Eddie contracted AIDS a year ago. While he was in hospital, his flat in Camden Hill Road, Notting Hill Gate, was wrecked in a fire. the local council temporarily rehoused him in Tremner Gardens, North Kensington, a long way from most of his friends and haunts. Friend Heather Priestley of Earl's Court said, "I think he knew he was going to die." Another pal, writer Glenna Lloyd, recalled sadly he was burnt out.
The newspaper is a bit vague on the friend's statements. Surely they had more to say when the journalist approached them.
I'm so glad that you raised the point, because I had the same thinking as well, actually. So I thought, right, okay, so let me go and see if I can find out from the ladies themselves what Edward was really like. So I found Glenna Lloyd, I dropped her a line, but sadly I haven't heard anything back. And I believe I found the fellow artist Heather Priestley. And I know that once I reached out to her, she looked up my stories on Instagram, perhaps to see who this crazy guy was and what I was all about. But sadly, I didn't hear anything back, possibly because it wasn't the right Heather Priestley. But I think looking back retrospectively at this article, I think it's clear what the journalist's intentions were.
To vilify and stigmatize Eddie?
Oh, exactly. There's no question of that. Because Edward is clearly a fantastic artist. He must have had some fabulous friends who probably have got some fantastic stories to tell. And the journalist chose not to add those into the article, because I think what he's doing with the quotes that the two ladies gave, he's feeding into the narrative of don't give this man any sympathy, because look, his business associate and his previous landlord both said that he liked to live in the fast lane. And you've got the previous landlord alluding that, you know, he perhaps was living a life of promiscuity because he's going to gay discos and he knows about AIDS, but, you know, if he gets it, he gets it. There's nothing he can do about it. So when you've got Heather saying that he knew he was going to die, I think that feeds into the reader of, look, he knew he had the AIDS virus. He knew he was going to die, but he still continued to live in the fast lane, this fast lifestyle. He was doing it deliberately, so don't give him any sympathy whatsoever. And in regards to the quote from Glenna Lloyd saying that, you know, he was burnt out, again, that feeds into the narrative. Look, he's living in the fast lane, he's got the AIDS, but he right up until he died, he burnt himself out. When in reality, he would have known that he was going to die from AIDS because there was no treatment, no cure back in 1984 when he spent several months in hospital with an AIDS-related illness before returning home. So he knew he was going to die. So when Heather says that he knew he was going to die, it's the fact. He would have known that he was going to die.
Yeah.
But is the reader thinking that? And when Glenna says that, you know, he burnt himself out, I think that's probably in reference to the fact that with an AIDS diagnosis, when you get towards the end, your immune system's been depleted, the virus is taking hold, you've lost shitloads of weight, you're tired, you're fatigued. This is all well documented by, you know, people that have passed away from AIDS and AIDS-related illness. So, yeah, he probably would have come across as though he was burnt out, he was fucking knackered, you know, he was whacked. So, again, probably innocent statement that she's made there feeds into the reader that, you know, he was living in the fast lane and burnt himself out living in the fast lane. That's just my take on it anyway.
You mentioned there was an inquest into Eddie's death?
Yes, and the inquest was held on the 15th of January 1985, a little over 3 months after Eddie passed away. And the verdict and manner of Eddie's death was published in 3 national newspapers: the Daily Post, the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian newspaper, the day after the inquest on the 16th of January 1985. And the Guardian newspaper also published a headshot of Eddie and shared detail that perhaps gives a more plausible explanation for Eddie being, to quote the News of the World article, a recluse who had lost weight, dignity and the will to live. As the Guardian newspaper states, the inquest was told that Mr. Cairns of Tranmere Court, Kensal Green, London, had been receiving treatment for AIDS at the hospital for 2 months. In July, he had thorough tests and doctors believed that he had the kind of pneumonia which made death inevitable. And the doctor, Dr. Farthing, who was treating Eddie, told the inquest he had recovered enough from the pneumonia to be able to go home. I would have expected Edward to live about 2 more years, so I was surprised he died so quickly.
So did he spend 2 months in hospital, or do you think he was being treated as an outpatient?
At this point in the articles, it's not really clear, is it? But I can confirm that he was in hospital for quite a few months. And also as well, remember from the News of the World article, they mentioned that he was away from home in hospital for a period, that a fire broke out and ruined his home, and he had to be rehoused. And I think also as well, it's a good point really to raise in the fact that where HIV/AIDS is manageable today, back then you did rely on a lot more hospital intervention because the virus was depleting your immune system and you would fall ill with what really are relatively minor infections and would need to go to the hospital and seek treatment. And I know we're going to cover this on future episodes in regards to the Broderick ward. I know there's a few people that would jovially say the Broderick ward was a little bit like a hotel. They would ring up, ask if they had a bed because they weren't feeling well. Yes, there's a bed coming, and they would just turn up and spend... It was never seemed to be a few nights there. They would be there for weeks and months. And from documents that I've read, They didn't enjoy it. They weren't being mistreated, but obviously they would rather be living their life outside from the hospital confines. But they were there, always there for a period, a long period, until they felt well enough to be able to go home. And it seems to be the case here with Edward.
So if Eddie was discharged from the hospital around July, as this article states, he must have been home for 2 months before he died.
Yes, and who knows how Eddie was dealing with his diagnosis and prognosis of impending death. I mean, it would take us to have the power of his mind to understand if he fell into a form of depression, as the news of the world alludes, but given many have documented their untreatable AIDS diagnosis, it is highly probable that Edward was just exhausted and tired, hence why he remained home and was labelled a recluse. Being fatigued may have come across to others as him losing the will to live. I mean, they mention his weight loss, which I think with hindsight we perhaps understand that stage of his diagnosis. And Edward's doctor shared more detail to the inquest, which was reported in the Guardian article as follows. Dr. Charles Farthing, who is a research registrar with the AIDS team at St Stephen's Hospital in London, was speaking after an inquest on a man who died from the disease within 8 days of reporting ill with diarrhea.
Do you think that doctors perhaps misjudged the timeline of Edward's diagnosis? Or maybe he fell ill at home, given he's open to opportunistic infections?
I mean, it's never helpful to speculate, is it? But I think with greater understanding and from documented accounts of the latter stages of AIDS today, you're probably onto something, given something as mundane as diarrhea is a symptom of latter stages of AIDS. A paper in The Lancet from 1995, volume 346, issue 8971, pages 352 to 356, talks about diarrhea and, quote, wasting, which is referring to weight loss, being symptoms of what they term, quote, advanced HIV, which, is AIDS. If Edward was so unwell in hospital, then yes, maybe an opportunist infection made him fall unwell at home, as Edward reported 8 days prior to his death to his doctor that he was suffering from a serious bout of diarrhea.
But neither of us are medical professionals.
No, but I do know around these early years, doctors were making statements in the press that I find a little jaw-dropping today, but highlights that while they knew the basics of AIDS and its routes of transmission, some doctors were making statements such as somebody with antibody of AIDS who was now feeling better wouldn't necessarily develop into, quote, full-blown AIDS. And we just know today that that's simply not true, because if you've got antibodies for HIV/AIDS, I mean, I was diagnosed with them finding antibodies for HIV, then it will develop into AIDS if it's left untreated. So, they were all making these statements around 1984, 1985, which is the same time that Edward passed away. So I think sometimes you just have to be a little bit careful to believe that what the doctors were saying at the time was fact. And I think sometimes it is very easy with an unknown disease for them to make mistakes or just get things slightly wrong. And obviously, the more they learned about the disease as time went on, then obviously things became a lot more accurate and factual.
That's quite something.
Yeah, but it shows, like we learned with COVID-19, when a new virus emerges, even the people you look to for answers are often learning as they go, albeit at a much more advanced rate than us, than Joe Public. And I can't help but wonder if Edward's diagnosis had come a few years later, if the nature of his death would have been better recorded.
How did they document Edward's death?
Well, the Guardian article concludes, Mr. Cairns was found dead at his home on October the 4th, a day after his friend had called, got no reply and assumed that he was asleep. See, this is a little different. It's a little bit more sympathetic than the News of the World's article that said a friend was allegedly calling for a £20 debt. I mean, maybe they had, but regardless, they were considerate enough to allow Eddie to rest and try again the following day. And the article continues, by the time his naked body was found on his bed, doctors believed that he had been dead for 2 days. The exact cause of death was unclear, and the coroner, Dr. John Burton, recorded an open verdict. The circumstances of this man's death are unsatisfactory, the coroner said. If his body had been found earlier, it might have been possible to make further examination, added the coroner.
So there are no answers?
In short, no. Edward's death certificate documents the cause as per the verdict of the inquest, not ascertained, found at home, open verdict. So my personal view, not that it's worth anything and not that I'd given it much thought, if any, but if I was going to take my own life, I doubt I'd want to be found naked. So perhaps that rules out Edward taking his own life. Being found naked on his bed may suggest he was either getting out of bed or getting into bed or just out of the shower when he lost consciousness and fell onto the bed where he was found.
Good point.
And far be it from me to question Dr. Farvin's medical and professional opinion that he believed Edward had another 2 years left in him. Maybe he did. But for me, I think collectively, when you look at the information, that Edward was in hospital for quite a few months unwell. He'd lost a hell of a lot of weight. He'd had this serious bout of diarrhea 8 days prior to him passing away, so he clearly wasn't well. And I just can't help but think that in regards to his AIDS diagnosis, I think sadly the end was quite close for Edward. Now there's other possibilities as well. You know, he perhaps could have hit the bottle. And I think if I was in his position, I'd want to numb out, knowing that there's no treatment, there's no cure, I'd want to numb out the pain. I'd want to drink myself into oblivion so you're semi-unconscious, you're not aware of what's going on. You may even consider taking his own life. We'll never know.
And what do you make of the coroner, stating that if Edward had been found earlier, they may have been able to make a ruling?
If I'm honest, I'm a little bit miffed. I mean, I have seen so many documentaries on post-mortem cases and where there have been many instances where a body is found weeks or months later, and yet they can still determine a cause of death. I mean, for example, my great-uncle lay dead at home for a month, and the coroner informed me they needed to cremate the body ASAP given the decomposition, yet were able to carry out a post-mortem and determine that there was a bleed on the brain. So I wonder if it has more to do with what we previously uncovered in a previous episode with Stuart Thompson-Neal and Dr. Keith Simpson, given the article states in Edward's case. Yesterday's inquest at Hammersmith was told that pathologists at St Stephen's Hospital were not prepared to carry out a post-mortem examination on Mr. Cairns, partly because the body had begun to decompose, and partly because of a fear of infecting themselves.
So they're not saying it's impossible to do a post-mortem, they're saying they don't want to.
It seems so. And it's that wording, from the article that says, partly because of a fear of infecting themselves. They are saying it was possible. They could have done it because it was 50-50. 50% they didn't want to do it because it was the decomposed side. So that's, yes, I'm sure that's unpleasant, but I'm sure they've dealt with it before. But the 50% that they could do a post-mortem, they're saying, no, we don't want to because we might infect ourselves. So it doesn't seem like it's impossible to do a post-mortem on Edward. It just seems that they didn't want to. And that's incredibly sad.
That's sad.
Edward Cairns, known to his friends affectionately as Eddie, was 34 years old when he passed away. Born in Johnston, Scotland on the 18th of January 1950. His death was registered on the 18th of January 1985, what would have been his 35th birthday. His occupation on his death certificate is given as artist of number 12 Tranmere Gardens, London, NW10, which has since been demolished.
So, was the verdict of the inquest the final word?
Well, no, because there is another article from the Shepherd's Bush Gazette on the 18th of January 1985, what would have been Eddie's 35th birthday. And the coroner, Dr. John Burton, isn't happy, and the headline of the article reads, Coroner hits out after AIDS sensation, with the strapline, newspapers and the disease of the gays. It sounds like a film, doesn't it? The disease of the gays. And the article reads, a coroner has slammed newspapers for concentrating on the spread of the killer disease, AIDS. Dr. John Burton said national newspapers were only interested in the sensational disease and ignored other illnesses. He levelled criticism after the inquest of artist Eddie Cairns at Hammersmith Coroner's Court on Tuesday morning. Representatives from the national newspapers and agencies swarmed on the court following publicity in a Sunday newspaper.
That's the article from the News of the World.
Yes, and the article continues. They rushed out after the case and ignored the next inquest on a man who died from hepatitis, a more infectious disease.
Is that true?
Yeah, I asked the same thing. And I think we've been dragged along with the fear and stigma of HIV over the decades that we are petrified of it and perhaps associate that fear with it being highly infectious. I mean, Terence Higgins Trust and AIDS Map and your own CDC all state that hepatitis B is, quote, extremely infectious and is 50 to 100 times more infectious than HIV. Anyway, this article continues. Dr. Burton said, the world's press crowd in here when it's a case of AIDS, but do not care about other more infectious diseases which are more common. And they are only interested in AIDS because homosexuals can contract it. Oh, I'm loving Dr. John Burton. And it's very reminiscent of the previous episode we did with Michael Bedford's inquest, the coroner then, Dr. Natman, who was calling out the doctor that had merely given the suspicion of him passing away from AIDS just because he was a gay man. And here you've got Dr. John Burton that's seen with his own eyes that once he's given the verdict into Edward's death, that the media have all just packed up, got up and left the court. And it's quite clear that the media are only there not because Edward is a man who's passed away from AIDS, but because Edward is a gay man that's passed away from AIDS.
I agree.
Because it's all feeding into the fact that gay men were being vilified and stigmatised because of this virus. And the article continues. Eddie Cairns, 34, died at his home in Trenmar Gardens, College Park on October the 4th. He had suffered the wasting disease that destroys the body's defences for months. Mr. Cairns had contracted pneumonia earlier last year and was treated at St. Stephen's Hospital. His health deteriorated rapidly and doctors did not expect him to live long. He was found 2 days after his death by a friend who called to collect a debt. Dr. Burton recorded an open verdict because a post-mortem could not be carried out due to the length of time Mr. Cairns had been dead. The inquest on freelance photographer Raoul Abbott took place afterwards. Mr. Abbott, 58, died on New Year's Day after suffering hepatitis for a year. His health worsened over the Christmas period until he was forced to go into Charing Cross Hospital where he died. Dr. Burton recorded a verdict of natural causes.
That's sad.
And the headline of that article attracted a reader to write into the Acton Gazette on Friday the 1st of February 1985, and the newspaper published the letter under the headline, How to Counter AIDS Hysteria with More Facts. And the reader writes, Coroner hits out after AIDS sensation, was the story. It detailed how a local coroner had censored the media for swooping in on AIDS-related inquests. Hear, hear, the level of hysteria in the press, especially the national tabloids, about this disease has appalled and disheartened me. At last someone hits out. However, I would like to take you to task for your strap headline, Newspapers and the Disease of Gays. With a little elementary research, you would have realised that although AIDS is at present cutting swathes through the American homosexual community and is causing concern among gays here, it did in fact originate in Africa, and heterosexuals there have been dying from it for years. It is interesting to note, too, that you devoted almost 5 column inches to the AIDS inquest and the mere 1 inch to the man who died from hepatitis. I don't know whether you know, and it is tragically ironic in this instance, that hepatitis used to be a disease linked most often with homosexuals. That is until the media picked up the fact that a far more sensational disease was appearing. Furthermore, to counter AIDS hysteria, it would have been heartening to me and your other gay readers if you had tried to put the AIDS topic in some sort of context. Low-key, basic information like just how many people have died from the disease in this country, what sort of research is being carried out, and maybe even a sympathy-inducing line or two about what the disease does to a person, heterosexual or homosexual, wouldn't have gone amiss. Jeff Grace, McKay House, White City.
What an incredibly sad story. A young man with so much potential. Did he have any family?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Edward Cairns was born in Johnston in Scotland before moving to London, and he was at the time survived by his father John Cairns, who passed away in 1991, and his mother Mary, who passed away in 2007, along with his younger sister of 4 years, who passed away in 2013. He is survived by his niece Gail, who I reached out to, but sadly I have had no response so far. And Mozaffar Aminian, who was quoted in the News of the World article as saying, Eddie was a marvellous personality and one of the best young artists in Britain. He had vast potential. Well, Mr. Amanian is still alive and has been very influential in the art world. I reached out to him but have had no response thus far. But who knows with those connections what heights Eddie Cairns, the artist, would have reached.
Absolutely. What an incredibly sad story. And we're staying in the arts with this next story from 1996.
Don't be scared.
Oh no, is it an emotional one?
No. It's not an emotional one, don't worry. But going from the art world of Eddie Cairns the painter to another form of art, which is called conceptual documentary expressionism. I have no idea what that means. But don't be scared is the name of a HIV/AIDS art exhibition that hits London in 1996.
Oh, this sounds interesting.
And the exhibition is reported in the Independent newspaper on the 12th of June 1996, and the article tells us what it's all about. In London's newest visual art space, people suffering from AIDS are the exhibits. Talking to them and touching them becomes the artistic experience, an experience in which the striking live image is only part of the overall effect. Files of HIV-contaminated blood are on the white table in front of the sofa.
I don't know how I feel about... but... but I guess that's the point of the exhibition, to provoke thought.
And I know what you mean. The thought makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. Not because it's, quote, contaminated blood, but just because it's blood, really. Even looking at my own blood, sometimes I get a little bit dizzy and lightheaded. But also as well, it's very personal, isn't it? But you're bang on in what you're saying, because the article states the purpose of the exhibition is, and I quote, provoking the visitor into thinking about social issues is an integral part of the artistic experience. And where are you with getting naked?
Are they naked?
Yep, because one of the participants they call an exhibit is 35-year-old David Herndon White from Los Angeles. He says he has, quote, full-blown AIDS and has had so for the last 3 years. David is quoted as stating, "If you take away the robe, I'm sitting here with my disease, and that really scares people. People are terrified. Men tend not to come up close. Women tend to engage in conversation."
For the time, David makes an interesting point. In reading down the article, the artist Tony shares that he got the idea from visiting galleries and seeing "please do not touch" signs everywhere, and wanted to turn it on its head and make a "please touch" exhibition. He states, "I immediately thought of a person with AIDS. Once they are diagnosed, they are stripped of that basic human pleasure of being hugged. So I thought maybe I can do something here."
And you know, he's spot on. And still today, albeit a small minority, and those that deliberately weaponize HIV use touch as an excuse to be stigmatizing. Given that I was diagnosed at the start of the COVID-19 national lockdown, my clinician and the pharmacist both stated, "I so want to give you a hug, but with the law on COVID-19 contact, I can't." And at the time, actually, I must admit, even though I'm not a huggy person, I would have quite appreciated a hug.
Was David the only one to take part, or were there others?
There were 3 men and a woman, all living with HIV, that took part in the exhibition, and they took it in turns to be the naked exhibit on the sofa. One man that took part, called Glenn Gaylord, yes, that is his real name, who is also gay, took part in the exhibition. On the 27th of October 1997, he told the Salt Lake Tribune, a newspaper in America, that he's, quote, lived with AIDS for about 17 years. And the nosy part got the better of me, and I looked up Glenn Gaylord to see where he was today, and I'm pleased to say that he's still thriving with HIV.
Awesome.
And with IMBD stating, and I quote, "Glenn Gaylord is a writer, director, producer whose films have won over 30 awards." So he seems to have made it in the filmmaking business. And there is a lengthy documented history of his work in gay and HIV/AIDS activism. Glenn Gaylord clearly showing that even with a HIV diagnosis, with effective treatment, you can go on to achieve great things.
All of the actual newspaper articles mentioned in this serving are available on the Extra T blog. You can find the link below in the show notes. If you've enjoyed listening to AIDS, The Lost Voices, then don't be a shady bitch and show us some love with
A big fat like,
a comment,
a share, as in the link, not as in, do you believe in life after love? Oh.
and for fuck's sake, don't forget to
Subscribe and follow.